Hi, I'm Ethan, one of the hosts on the Green Room podcast. Episode 47 is all about ethical use of artificial intelligence as we set out to answer the big question, can AI help us be more human? We were joined by Sandra Wachter from the Oxford Internet Institute and Sulabh Soral, Chief AI Officer at Deloitte. It was a great conversation. I actually used generative AI to write the intro to this episode and see how it compared to mine. How did it go? And do I still have a future as a podcast host? You'll have to tune in to find out. You can listen to previous episodes on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and leave us a comment too. Where do you think the future of AI lies?
Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm George Parrett, and in this episode we ask, can AI help us be more human? Hello and thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. You can find all of our previous episodes and loads of additional content on our shiny new website, which is deloitte.co.uk/Green Room Podcasts. And today we're talking about all things AI or artificial intelligence. And joining me is someone who is the embodiment of natural intelligence, my wonderful co-host, Ethan Worth. How are you, Ethan?
I'm good, thanks, George. Feeling very flattered after that intro. And we'll find out if natural intelligence is important anymore, or if we just need artificial. Yes, I actually asked a generative AI chatbot to write the intro to this episode, and it scarily sounds like you, George. So you may be out of a job.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, okay, go on then. Let's see how well they did.
Okay. Welcome to the Deloitte Green Room podcast, where we explore the latest trends and insights on sustainability, innovation, and business transformation. In this episode, we'll be discussing how artificial intelligence is helping us to be more human. AI is often associated with futuristic visions of robots and automated systems taking over our jobs and lives. However, the reality is quite different. AI has the potential to amplify our human abilities and enable us to be more efficient, empathetic, and creative in our personal and professional lives. In this episode, we'll be joined by experts who will share their insights on how AI is being used to enhance human capabilities, such as improving healthcare outcomes, increasing workplace productivity, and promoting sustainable practices. We'll also explore the ethical implications of using AI and how we can ensure that it aligns with our values and aspirations as a society. So whether you're a business leader, a sustainability enthusiast, or just curious about the future of tech, tune into this episode to learn more about how AI is helping us to be more human.
Oh, goodness, Ethan. I think we're in trouble, Ethan. Far better than what I could do. But let's lead by the AI bot suggestion. And who are the experts in the studio with us today?
So today, George, we're joined by Sandra Wachter. She's a Professor of Technology and Regulation at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She researches the legal and ethical implications of AI, big data, and robotics, as well as internet and platform regulation, and serves as a policy advisor for governments, companies, and non-profits around the world. Her work has been prominently featured in several documentaries, including pieces by Wired, the BBC, New York Times, and Harvard Business Review. Hi, Sandra.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me.
Great to have you with us. We're also joined by Sulabh Soral. Sulabh Soral is Chief AI Officer at Deloitte Consulting and has 20 years experience in product innovation, data science and technology. He leads the Deloitte AI Institute in the UK and advises global C-level executives on AI and exponential technology-led transformations. Hi, Sulabh.
Hello, great to be here.
I think we really need to get into the topic of the day. And, Sandra and Sulabh, you've both got really interesting careers, and I think just to help our listeners just warm up to the idea of artificial intelligence, could you explain a little bit about how you got into the world of AI and how your sort of careers followed this path? Sandra, perhaps you go first.
Yes. So I'm a lawyer by background, so I'm very interested in the legal and ethical implications of emerging technologies. I started off actually looking at how technology can improve the health of people. So originally, I actually worked in public policy in the health sector, and I have a degree in medical, an additional degree in medical law, and I was just very interested in the question how technology can improve people's healths and lives. And then starting from that perspective, I just ventured out eventually and was just getting more and more interested in all things technology, because I think it's not just health where tech can actually improve our society. It's many other areas as well. And so even though I'm health native, over the last 10 years or so, I just broadened my scope, and I got just very interested what AI can do for businesses, for society, for education, for employment, for art, for any of our aspects of our lives, because I think there's just immense opportunity to create a more interesting world for all of us.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think we'll definitely touch on some of your experience there in this conversation. And how about you, Sulabh? How did you become Chief AI Officer and get involved in artificial intelligence?
Frankly, I do not know how I became Chief AI Officer at Deloitte, but let me talk about how I got into AI in the first place. So I'm a career data scientist, and when I basically, my background is in statistics and econometrics, which is like application of like it's a statistical and econometric modeling to sort of like economic situations. So that's how I got into data science. And then for the last 11 years or so, I've been at Deloitte, set up the machine learning practice at Deloitte. And then from there on, as technology evolved, we learned new things, and we got involved in perhaps newer kind of algorithms and newer kind of use cases. And that has been my journey. And my interests are really in how do you make AI sort of like consumer centric. That's what I advise on, and that's what I've been doing for some time.
That's super interesting, and actually, just building on that, then, Sulabh, I think you're probably in a good place to actually, tell us and our listeners what do we mean when we're talking about AI? What is artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, the academic definition of artificial intelligence is quite wide, and I'm not an academician, I'm a practitioner. So my definition of artificial intelligence is sort of like, fundamentally it's a software. Fundamentally it's software. And you can sort of like, instead of hard coding rules, what you're really doing is you're utilizing data and sort of like, a different sort of kind of architecture in terms of algorithms to auto learn rules. Now I know it's a very sort of like very applied kind of definition, but that's how I define artificial intelligence.
And Sandra, from the academic side of things, how would you round it off?
Yeah, I think I would very much agree with that definition. In my head, I always try to distinguish between two types of algorithmic systems: the ones where we have predefined rules and we know what it is supposed to execute, something very similar to a calculator, for example, where you give basic rules to a system and I teach it that 2 and 2 is 4, and it will just execute a number of rules that I pre-code into it. And those types of algorithms are in use for decades now, and they help us to make decisions that are not terribly complex because we already know how we want to decide about them. The more interesting types of algorithms are the ones where we don't predefine rules, and we actually use algorithms to let them find the rules, because we imagine that an algorithm that has so much capacity to sift through so much data will have the ability to come up with more interesting connections than a human ever could. And so we're tasking the algorithm to say, well, you come up with the rules, you tell me who the best candidate is, rather than me telling you what I think a good job candidate is, for example. And so those are roughly the two ways of how I would distinguish the ones where we have predefined rules and the other ones where we use machine learning capabilities to ask the algorithm, well, tell me what makes a good worker, or what makes a good person to ask for a loan. Like, tell me about the capabilities of that person. So that's roughly how I would distinguish.
And if we think about AI, I mean, for some of our listeners who aren't as au fait with the term, they might think of kind of sci-fi and robots, but actually it's been around in everyday use for a while, I believe. Have you guys got any examples of kind of everyday things that we do that involve AI? Maybe some that make your lives better?
Yeah, I think I'm surrounded by artificial intelligence, and most of us are throughout our whole day. And most of it is making my life infinitely better. So if I think about, that I'm waking up in the morning and I want to, figure out I would like to read the newspaper, and I'm going on Twitter, for example, and I'm trying to figure out what's currently trending, and I see the news sources listed there. This is something that is prepared by an algorithm for me, according to what the algorithm thinks I might think is interesting. If I then realize drinking my morning coffee, I don't have milk anymore, I can then use, for example, Amazon or other online services to do my grocery, and algorithms will then, give me certain offers, for example, and say, customers who also like milk also like this particular product, and offer me that type of product as well. Again, an algorithm trying to estimate what I would like in my life. And then I go to work, where I try to figure out when a bus is coming and when it's running, if it's going to be late, and an algorithm will tell me about that as well. And if I have to meet somebody for the first time and I don't know where their office is, well, an algorithm will guide me there as well. And so almost everything that we do in our daily lives is somewhat, touched by an algorithm. For me personally, what I do use algorithms for in my work, and again, I'm an academic, I'm a professor, so most of my work is focused on teaching and researching. And so, for example, I personally use dictation software for research purposes, because that has greatly increased my productivity. I'm not a very fast typer, but I'm a very fast speaker. And so I use that software to help me increase my output. And I have a software that has machine learning capabilities, because, as you might hear, I'm not a native speaker. And so most of the off-the-shelf software don't actually recognize my accent, and they don't know what to do with it. Whereas the machine learning capability of my software learns how I speak, how I express things, and is not constantly confused by that, which again did actually improve my output quite significantly.
That's really interesting, Sandra, and definitely a real example of how AI can be used as a tool to make the way we do work and go about our lives, better, which is the sort of subject of the day. But just before we get into the good and the bad side of AI, I suppose, you can't get away from opening a newspaper or reading your algorithm curated news email in the mornings without reading about the latest in generative AI, which seems to be the hot topic at the moment. What has changed for us to get to this stage of generative AI?
What really has happened is you have given a whole host of data to really large compute resources. You've used a lot of compute resources, and you have used a lot of data to produce something that is able to generate human language, right? So therefore, if you ask me what's really changed, well, what's really changed is the increasing digitization, along with the internet, access to data, and access to massive compute. That's what really changed. And it's quite interesting that, and I'm right now I'm only talking about generative AI. Comes in many sort of like different sort of like colors. So you can use generative AI to produce text. You can use generative AI to produce new imagery, artists, like an artist, or music. But if you stick to, for simplicity, if you stick to generative AI that produces language, what basically it enables you to do today is to generate programs, code. You can code, you can write a novel, you can write an article. And so that's what generative AI is. And the difference really is that you have AI that is generating for you, rather than let's say AI that is categorizing stuff for you. This is a cat versus this is a dog, or it's forecasting something like, this is going to be the revenue. Given the revenue is X, this is going to be the revenue you can in the next, let's say, in the next couple of months. What this is doing is generating language, and therefore the cognitive sort of task it's really doing is it's mimicking human creativity.
A lot of the criticism around AI is around how it's not as inclusive as it should be, and certain segments of society are either excluded or the data is not rounded enough to fully capture what the sort of true picture. What's your solution to that that problem, and is that just kind of what's the cause, and how do we sort of resolve that fundamental problem with AI and inclusivity?
Yes, I think that's a very, very important, not easy to answer question. And so we have to be very, very thinking about this very seriously, because the bias problem and the injustice problem is really at the root of all of this. And this is no surprise. Large language models, like any type of algorithmic system, it needs massive amounts of data. And if you will, data is nothing but a mirror of our society, or the data traces that we leave behind whenever we engage with the technology, right? So whatever tweets are on the internet, whatever pictures are on the internet, whatever content is on the internet, music, videos, whatever it might be, reflects the status quo. And the algorithm will learn that status quo. And unless you're really happy with how the status quo is working, there's a problem. And the issue is that the majority of our society is not happy with how the status quo is working. And so whatever unfairness or injustice or assumptions or biases or prejudice is there is reflected in this data. It will learn from that. It will take it up and just embed it into their own processes. And that means that the technology is always going to be flawed unless we change society for the better. So this is not to say this is a doomsday scenario, right? What's really, really important is there's a difference between saying there's a problem and saying, therefore, don't use it, or saying there's a problem and just think how to use it. And the issue is really that people don't want to listen to that and assume that the algorithm is biased because they think that means that it's all doomed. No, we're only doomed if we pretend that there is no problem. And it's just about finding the right solution on how to tackle that. And there are various things how you can do that, but it's not a one-fits-all solution kind of thing, because it's a very structured, systematic problem, and you would need to do various things at the same time.
A lot of the algorithms that consume this data, a lot of the data that we capture is actually proxy for something else that we're trying to capture. An example is I spent a better part of my early Deloitte career in researching on how do you fairly price motor insurance. Age is a variable that has been used in motor insurance pricing, right? And if you go deep into it, why is age used? Because we were not able to objectively measure somebody's experience of driving. And experience definitely has a direct correlation, a higher correlation. And when I say experience, not in terms of temporal experience, what I mean is basically the rate at which somebody learns to drive really well, and that rate might be different for different people. So age was a proxy. So one is the technologies with which we have captured data, or we continue to capture data, might not be fit for purpose, and we might be capturing proxies, which again cause a problem, right? Then you get into this the gender and the age and all of that kind of problem. That's one. Always products are launched for a certain segment of the market. There are very few products which are general, right? Like maybe bread is general, everybody, most of the world eats bread. But there are products which people launch, whether it's in financial services, or whether it's in fashion or wherever. It's launched for a certain market segment. Now what you do is you start collecting that data, but of course it's going to be biased because it's for a certain market segment. And if you start using that data to predict outcomes in another product line, the bias travels. So there is this whole thing when you think about is, how is data captured? What are the technologies to capture data? And how to objectively measure and not take proxies? And that's a very difficult ask in a highly digitized modern world where people are just basically funneling all of the data into these algorithms. And that's not about historical biases. That's about sort of just better sort of appreciation of how data is being captured.
I know, Sandra, you've written about ensuring that AI technology has a kind of black box technology, so that we try and understand, what went wrong in terms of the data that's being captured and the answers that are being created. Is that the best solution for this?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it has to be a couple of different types of solutions. You definitely need to work on the societal level, so we actually have data that is unbiased, but it's a tall order, and it will take some time until we actually achieve societal change. But it cannot be divorced from tech solutions, because tech solutions are always only a plaster. You actually need to heal the underlying wound in order to improve the situation. But as an interim solution, tech can help you a little bit. Tech can help you to detect how bad the situation really is, in terms of just trying to compare how different algorithms affect certain communities in our society, right? Which if you didn't test for it, you wouldn't know that it affects them. So you would just perpetrate a bias unknowingly and exacerbate existing inequalities. But you could use bias testing to figure out how it actually affects communities. But so trying to test to figure out how biased the system is one thing, and the other has to do with explainability, because it's input, something magical happens in the black box, and then there's output, and what happens in between is something that is really hard to understand for anybody, but even for the people who coding those systems. And that means, again, this doesn't mean that we say, oh, well, this is just how the cookie crumbles. We have a system that nobody understands. Let's just implement it everywhere. No, it means that we have to figure out if there are ways of at least understanding a little bit more of what's going on inside the black box, because it's really, really important in terms of accountability and fairness and transparency to have a better understanding of that. And yes, explainability is part of that. So bias testing and understanding how an algorithm makes a decision and why is paramount in order to deploy the system in a safe and ethical way.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? Like Loaf Catering, part of Now Group in Northern Ireland, they support people with learning difficulties and autism into jobs with a future. If you're based in Belfast, you can now order Loaf's delicious food to go. If you're further away, just visit loafcatering.com, where you'll find beautiful mugs handmade by Loaf's in-house potter. Now, back to our topic of the day. Maybe if we take now a bit of a gear shift, because we've spoken about some of the everyday examples of AI and what that means. We've spoken about the importance of using AI in the right way. But maybe now if we look forward into some of the kind of potential and possibilities for AI, and what some of the kind of big challenges are that AI could help us tackle. So I guess the first one potentially on our mind is climate change. And is there anything that's happening in the AI space that can help us tackle that big problem that we're facing as a globe?
There are so many examples that are happening, and there are so many examples that Deloitte has been involved in, right? So right from sort of looking at utilizing AI with satellite imagery and sort of aerial imagery to figure out deforestation, for example. And I know sustainability is one topic, but I'm going to just sort of give broad sort of examples here, right? So there is that kind of thing that's happening. If you look at sort of the utilization of AI, particularly reinforcement learning and enabling cleaner sources of energy. Now, I wouldn't say that nuclear is more cleaner than, let's say, wind or whatever. But there's a lot of research going on in how do you basically control nuclear fusion using AI, which basically is obviously better than coal and nuclear fission. So that's so in energy, in sort of thinking about deforestation, in thinking about sort of different scenarios in terms of because obviously we all know that climate is a very, very complex system. And if you make any intervention in a very complex system, we do not understand the outcomes. And again, AI, particularly things like generative AI, are coming in use because you can now simulate. If I do this action, I can simulate what would my system look like. Is it still going to be sustainable or not?
I would just like to add to that. I'm also aware that there are researchers out there that use technology to actually combat climate change, and some of my colleagues are working on predicting how quickly ice bergs are melting, for example, that are using it to protect the wildlife in certain areas. And that's all fantastic stuff. But on the other side, we also have to say that help is not for free. Like the carbon footprint that AI leaves on the planet is just something that we shouldn't just, sweep under the table, under the rug here, because it's not a free tool. It is something that actually costs a massive amount of resources and computing power and data generation and work of people that are labeling that data. So there is just a societal and carbon footprint cost to that as well. So it's not just that AI will save the planet. There is also just a cost. So it's just as a counter example to that.
Am I allowed to say ouch as a data scientist? but if I just, it's a really important point, right? Which is, and if you look at the academic research, there is obviously academic research happening on the carbon footprint of algorithms. But Sandra is absolutely right. The carbon footprint goes the actual sort of footprint goes not only at the point of where algorithms are being trained, but right to chip manufacturing and everything, right? So it goes upstream. And then therefore it becomes really important to sort of coming back to that point. If you want to use AI specifically, well, anywhere, but if you want for climate change, for sustainability, then the perhaps and limit its carbon footprint, limit AI's carbon footprint, then perhaps you have to look at areas which are closed system, where you do not require ginormous amounts of data and you have low-hanging fruits. So for example, if you were to do some analysis on how a manufacturing plant is running versus produce a completely new large language model, those are two very different carbon footprint sort of calculations. And the return on sort of let's say, if I could use the return on investment or return on carbon, whatever you get on closed loop systems on to create efficiencies, particularly in this case, are far more than sort of trying to predict large systems or complex systems which require a lot of data and a lot of compute power.
Sandra, if I could just come to you quickly, we've sort of spoken about some of the areas where we're all excited about AI, but what would be your advice to people who might be feeling anxious about artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think anxiousness and fear are never good advisors for anything. And so I would like to remind everybody that every time there is a new technology that hits the stage, there is fear and there is panic and there is excitement. And humans are inherently bad at predicting the future in that sense, which is not to say we should not try to, assess what's going to come down the pike. But it just means that we have to constantly learn and relearn and then reevaluate the situation. And I think with Gen AI, we are very much at the beginning where we don't actually know how big of an impact this will be. And so what I would encourage people to do is just trying to, test out the technology, play around with it, figure out that it's actually not as sophisticated or scary or disrupting as some people might think, but maybe find out how it actually works. It takes a lot away from just the fears around it, and that should start really early on. I would do this for children, and I would do this as part of lifelong learning for everybody. Just becoming, somewhat acquainted with that type of technology, like we have with other technologies as well, and then you can see actually what's what. So and I think that's just what we need to do. We have to monitor the situation and just figure out how to embed it in a certain way. We already know certain risks and we have to tackle those, and we have certain opportunities that we can reap at this point. But I think keeping a close eye on that and in an inclusive way is something that I would suggest to everybody.
And with this idea of kind of humans versus AI, which you sometimes hear in some senses around them taking our jobs, in the most extreme ways, the singularity and the war of robots. But how do we kind of use it as a tool to enhance human intellect and creativity rather than compete with it?
Yeah, I guess I'd really like every type of technology is better at something than I am. Like a plane's better at flying than I am. Calculator's much better at math than I am. I don't know, Google Maps is really much better finding a pub than I am. Like, of course, and that's just, and good. Why else do we have it, right? And so I think, having something that is better at something than you is not the scary part. The scary part is if that is then used to replace you in some way, right? And that's really the thing that we have to counterbalance, that it's not me versus AI, but rather thinking about how can I use this to automate certain tasks that I don't like or that are time consuming without starting to threaten my livelihood based on that, right? And so that's just what we need to do. And that's a responsibility for companies and then policymakers to make sure that we make people's work lives more interesting, but also sustainable in the same way. So we don't move into a direction where we're just replacing everybody and creating unemployment.
And what would you say is your biggest hope for the future of humans and AI?
I really, really hope that we see that technology as something that works in tandem with humans, in the sense that I can see a very bright future, for example, in health, where AI is being used to come up with new drugs or is used to help doctors diagnose people or create treatment plans. I'm very much interested in the question of making decision-making more fair, equitable, transparent, and fair in that way, which is something that we weren't really able to do before that, because who knows how a human is making decisions, right? With algorithms, we at least have the opportunity to figure out what's actually going on. And so I want to see technology being used not just as something that makes whatever we're currently doing faster and cheaper, but actually something that creates human and societal value. And that ranges from education, that ranges to healthcare, that means any type of employment situation that is being improved, and that means growth and prosperity.
And I guess that's going to be really important, because if as a civilization we are not able to achieve it, then in the short, forget the long term, but even in the short term, these kind of technologies can be deflationary. So it will basically, so I think faster and cheaper is a good point. This is not about how do you make everything faster and cheaper, but this is about sort of how do you increase sort of human productivity, but then also sort of make sure that we have better social good distribution and a more sort of humane society. That's what basically will really add value, and that's what we would like to see in the future.
That's a good time to pause on, and I think there's plenty more questions we can ask, but I think we'll wrap this one up by asking finally a short response to this week's big question, which is, can AI help us be more human?
I have to be a lawyer. You have to tell me what it means to be human. Like, give me a definition. Then
we can ask an AI tool what it means to be human, perhaps. Yeah.
Definitely, one thing that you could do is that we are sort of humans like to be productive. Humans like to be creative. Humans like to sort of expand what we do, and sort of obviously, if you look at the kind of AI that's now coming is for human productivity. And as newer tools that actually enhance individual human creativity start coming in, you would see basically humans become more human, or maybe superhuman, right? And then there is, of course, sort of if you are able to use AI to scale social goods distribution, if you are able to use AI to sort of somehow digitally, in a hyper-personalized manner, educate all children, then society is becoming more human. And if you want to do that at scale, you will have to use AI and digital technology. So I guess the question in my mind is, how does an individual become human to superhuman? But then how does AI help society become humane? And those are the two sort of things in my mind.
Well, that seems like a great place to start. I think we could probably do about 10 episodes on this topic, I think. So, but Sandra and Sulabh, thank you so much for chatting to me and Ethan today about this and explaining a bit about AI. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
It was great to talk to all of you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad and hosted by George Parrett, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.